War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 1. What is war? In embarking on this podcast, I at first had a few concepts I wanted to share that have provided the foundation of my understanding of war and which allowed me to write professionally on the subject and succeed on the battlefield. I realized, however, that these subjects assume knowledge of other aspects of war I had learned without realizing initially that others may not know them. This forced me to deconstruct my own education and knowledge of war and brought me to this first episode, What is war? Like many subjects, there is no simple definition. Many can, and I'm sure will, argue that my definition is wrong. You could study the subject for a lifetime and still leave unsatisfied with a one-sentence meaning. But for the purposes of this podcast and the rest going forward, we will start with war is a competition between sovereign entities with mutually exclusive objectives. The definition itself requires some clarification. Why do I say sovereign entities? First, sovereign means that there is no higher authority controlling their actions within the realm of battle. If the actions of the combatants are controlled by others, the conflict is not with the immediate belligerents, it is with the other entity. Sometimes these non-sovereign combatants are called proxies. Proxy wars are very real. The ongoing conflict in Israel with Hamas, Hezbollah, and to a lesser degree the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, has been called, with justification, a proxy war between Israel and Iran. Iran would define the war as a proxy war between Iran and the United States. And here we develop one of the first issues. How much independence does the proxy have? Does Iran completely control Hamas? No. To what degree do they control Hamas? It's unknown. It's unknown to Hamas and Iran. And here the human element comes in. At one moment, Iran may be giving direct orders to Hamas to carry out specific tactical actions against Israel. At another, Hamas may be operating against Iran's wishes. Likewise, Israel is a sovereign nation that doesn't always do what the United States wants, but unquestionably must consider America's desires when conducting war. The concept of sovereignty doesn't simply extend to the warring entity. It likewise extends, and perhaps more importantly, to the leadership of the entity. A dictatorship allows complete freedom of action for the dictator to direct actions. However, even at this level of control, he is chained by the requirements of delegation. He needs his generals and admirals to follow his orders and his intent, if it is known, in order for his will to be done. Likewise, the economic might of the nation, which is required to wage war, is at least partially controlled by the bureaucrats in a communist dictatorship or the owners in a fascist dictatorship. It becomes far more complicated in other forms of government. With a parliamentary government, especially those operating in a coalition government, each political party partaking in the coalition must agree, in at least the general sense, the direction of the war. In the American form of government, constitutionally speaking, it is on Congress to declare war and on a completely different entity, the executive, as led by the president, to actually wage war, with different players all having their at times conflicting say on the decision to wage war, to fund the war, and the actual conduct of the war itself. While the nation itself is sovereign, those individuals who wage it may be under considerable constraints, even while we accept the concept of a nation-state as sovereign. This concept dating to the Treaty of Westphalia, to be discussed at another time. The implication of these conflicting authorities are profound and will be reinforced as we continue our study. But my definition of war was not limited to nations, but rather the more nebulous entities. These entities may have freedom of action within the confines of established laws. Here, corporations and some form of athletic teams and athletes can be seen as sovereign, insomuch as within their arena, they are free to act as they see fit to achieve victory. Two boxers may be said to be at war, both seeking a mutually exclusive objective, victory. Within the ring and within the rules of the sport, they struggle for the win. The concepts of strategy and tactics both apply, The levels of war, of which strategy and tactics are part of, we will discuss in detail in our next podcast. Corporations may conduct war over the market share for their particular products. Often, they may seek to change the laws to benefit their own side. This is a concept known as shaping the battlefield in military terms. While laws govern certain actions businesses may not take, laws can never address all the different ways people may adjust their actions, mixing creativity with knowledge. By the time the law catches up to an unfair but legal tactic or strategy, the competition may be over, or at least one side has gained a significant competitive advantage. But this podcast, while certainly borrowing from business and athletics and framing the concepts of war, is primarily focused on the deadly conflict usually waged by nation-states. This does not discount the tribal conflict, which is just as deadly to the participants, that is still common in many places. Rather, these highlight the reality of the anarchical state found when the nation-state loses control. It was this deadly lawlessness which the aforementioned Treaty of Westphalia attempted to control. Similarly, there remains a belief that if there was one supranational governing body, such as the UN, that war would cease to exist altogether. The attempt at a single sovereign to control all actions. The religious among us would recognize that as effectively God, a philosophical discussion for another time. For something as deadly and costly as war, one would assume that the motives and objectives would be entirely rational. But one culture's rational decision is another culture's inconceivable insanity. One of the great barriers to waging effective war is assuming your own beliefs and cultural imperatives are shared by your enemy. And likewise, never assume that the differences are what shape conflicts. Some of the most violent conflicts in history were conducted by people who are fundamentally of nearly the same culture. Communist nations have waged war against other communist nations. Christians against Christians, Sunni Muslims against other Sunni Muslims, and Sunni Muslims against Shiite Muslims. Even the clash of Hitler and Stalin saw two totalitarian dictatorships, both fundamentally based in complete socialist control over their respective nations, wage the most brutal one-on-one campaign in history. Geography, culture, religion, economics, or the simple egotistical pride of the ruler or ruling class have all been enough to steer a ship of state to a horrifically destructive conflict against its neighbor. Or the broad expanse of an ocean could not keep the two belligerents apart. The one shared characteristic of all wars is the ubiquitous nature of its existence. Humans are a competitive species, and war is the ultimate competition. As long as humans exist, so shall war. This human desire to compete can lead countries to wage war for no other reason than to deflect domestic concerns to outside threats, whether perceived, inflated, concocted, or very real. Knowing the instinctual desire for communities to rally together in times of war, framing anything as a war, can be a psychological trick, attempting to forge unity against the other. Often people assume that modern war is fundamentally different than ancient war. Technologically speaking, this is true. But the consequences, even in the pre-nuclear age, remained existential for those who fought it, and the nations who chose to wage it, and even those civilizations that wished to avoid it, but lacked the power to resist the stronger enemy. Powerful nations and peoples have been eradicated from history well before we split the atom. So having addressed sovereignty and entities, we must address mutually exclusive objectives. Game theory, a critical subject to understand for anyone waging war, and certainly yet another topic that will demand in-depth explanation later, has the concept of zero-sum game, which means there is a winner and a loser. There is no win-win. This does not mean that in the absence of a win-win, that war is inevitable. Nor does that mean that the possibility for both sides to benefit from not waging war will stop conflict from happening. Indeed, it can be the mere perception of zero-sum game that can be enough to cause one nation to embark upon a disastrous war. The personal motivations, perceptions, fears, and domestic calculus can all interfere with logical decision-making. In fact, rarely does pure logic play into a nation's decision-making calculus, and the more seemingly emotional and irrational the cause of the war can result in the most brutal conduct and crushing outcome. Humans are an imperfect creature, and war is the ultimate manifestation of that imperfection. Many, if not most wars, have been fought for limited gains and not for the eradication of the other, but not necessarily for lack of desire to eradicate the other, merely the realization that an existential war will exact a cost that may be too high for the initiating power to accept. Rather, a limited war for limited gains, be it territorial or diplomatic concessions, forced through violence. With an admittedly imperfect definition of war at least established, we can move on to the fundamental question of why entities, especially nations, engage in horrifically destructive violence. And put simply, the juice is worth the squeeze. Now, while the juice, otherwise known as the benefit, may be known, any nation embarking upon war cannot possibly know exactly how much squeeze or cost the war will demand. In fact, rarely in history has an aggressor accurately calculated the costs of war. Those that might have done so probably never initiated the conflict in the first place. More accurately put, the perceived juice is worth the estimated squeeze. On a more perfect planet, the juice would benefit the nation. Unfortunately, conflicts are often initiated for domestic political gain. The Argentinian invasion of the Falklands was primarily to deflect domestic criticism of the ruling junta. The rallying effect of the toxin's call cannot be overestimated. But as the call fades and the gory reality comes to the forefront, this jingoistic support can quickly wane to bitter regret and spell the end of the government who initiated it. The American Civil War saw Northerners initially strongly support a war to reunite the nation. However, after 2 years of bloody fighting and mixed, at best, results, Lincoln was forced to redefine the objective from saving the Union to freeing the enslaved. The moral benefit of a crusade to free the oppressed was a stronger motivator to the men forced to stand shoulder to shoulder in the face of Confederate guns. It must be remembered that wars between two nations are fought for 4 reasons. 2 of the reasons are the belligerents' leadership political motivations, and 2 of the reasons are the emotions of the men who will do the fighting. The closer these are matched, the more brutal the war. This can often explain why religious conflicts can be the most horrific of all. To return to the American Civil War, Lincoln wished to preserve the Union, but the men who fought, at least past the initial 2 years, were, by and large, fighting to free the slaves. Likewise, the Confederate leadership made quite clear they seceded to retain slavery as an institution, but they couched the fight as one of states' rights and individual freedom to the soldiers of the South. Considering the increasing use of the draft as the war progressed on both sides, one might question the efficacy of the message, as well as the strength of the cause itself. These moral crusades are admittedly shallow examples. Often men went to war in search of glory, relief from their dreary domestic reality, personal profit. Not without reason, many wars were described as prolonged pillaging campaigns with intermittent skirmishes. Prior to the modern era, one of the only means by which the average man could acquire wealth and lands was through combat. The possibility of monetary gain, the juice, was worth the hardship and even the possibility of death, the squeeze. Understanding the strength of your cause and that of your enemy is an important calculation before and during any conflict. And the stronger the motivating energy your men possess, the more options at your disposal. In the coming weeks and months, we will return to these concepts and reinforce them with more detail and examples. Thank you for staying with me during this, our foundational start to a very long journey. Like many such journeys, the first steps are often the hardest. So let me know what you liked about this episode, and how would you define war? Our next step will be looking at the levels of war. Thanks for joining us today. If you liked what you heard, please like, subscribe, rate, and comment. Most importantly, share with your friends. Join the conversation at the War 102 subreddit, and check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for links to more information and supporting videos. Send me an email at war102podcast@gmail.com. I look forward to your comments and hope you join us again next week. See you then.